By July 1940, the Third Reich controlled most of Western Europe. France had fallen. German forces controlled most of the continent. Britain remained. German air operations shifted towards Britain. The campaign was continuous with no end in sight. Aircraft crossed the Channel daily to strike airfields, infrastructure, production sites and supply networks, sustaining the British war effort. The Royal Air Force met those attacks in continuous engagement. Fighting occurred over land, over water, and over cities. Pilots flew numerous sorties. Aircraft were repaired, replaced, or lost. Losses mounted unevenly, often without warning. Air operations placed constant pressure on aircraft availability and their crews. Sustaining the upper hand became increasingly difficult. By late summer of 1940, the pressure had not eased. Britain needed pilots, and it needed them immediately. At the same time, the United States remained officially neutral. American citizens were not permitted to serve in foreign armed forces. Despite this, a small number of American pilots chose to leave the country. They traveled quietly, most often through Canada. Others went straight to England claiming to be British or even using false documents to conceal their American citizenship. There was more leniency as the demand was so high. By the time these pilots arrived in Britain, the air war was already underway. Many pilots learned going out on some of their first missions. The RAF accepted them where it could. From these volunteers, a new unit would be formed. On September 19, 1940, at the height of the air fighting over Britain, the Royal Air Force formed Squadron 71. It was the first of what would become the Eagle Squadrons. Its pilots were American volunteers serving under RAF command. A small number of them had already seen combat. Among them was Art Donahue, who had flown operational missions in France and Britain. Andy Mamedoff had also escaped from France and returned to combat duty. Most of the squadron, however, had only recently arrived from America. They were still under training while the air war continued around them. The squadron's early equipment reflected the transition. Squadron 71 initially operated training aircraft, the Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters, an aircraft already considered outdated for high-intensity air combat in Europe. The Buffalo had been designed for a different theater and role. Over Britain, it was underpowered, slow to climb, and ill-suited to fighter operations against the more modern German aircraft at the time. Rather than allow the Buffalo to define the unit's combat future, leadership made a deliberate push to move on. Landing procedures were relaxed in ways that all but guaranteed damage on arrival, accelerating the aircraft's removal from service. The tactic worked. By November 1940, the squadron began transitioning to Hawker Hurricanes. British fighter and bomber operations increasingly crossed into occupied Europe. Fighter-only missions began to appear, low, aggressive sorties meant to hit targets of opportunity. And bomber missions began flying with fighter cover, structured raids intended to draw German fighters into the air and force engagement. Despite their eagerness to enter combat, the Eagle Squadron pilots continued training through the winter. Squadron 71 was declared fully operational on February 5, 1941, flying defensive patrols from RAF Curtin in Lindsey. Its role was to protect airspace, respond to incursions, and maintain coverage along the channel approaches. In April 1941, 71 Squadron was moved into a more forward role, assigned to 11 Group and based at Martlesham Heath. That same month, the squadron upgraded again, replacing earlier Hurricanes with a newer Hurricane variant. The aircraft improved, but the reality remained. In the air, performance mattered, and German fighters still held advantages in key areas. Combat contact followed quickly. After arriving at Martlesham Heath, Number 71 began flying missions that brought them into Luftwaffe activity over the Channel and near the French coast. Squadron 71 would not remain alone for long. As the air war continued into 1941, the Royal Air Force authorized the formation of 2 additional American manned units. On May 14, 1941, Squadron 121 was formed at RAF Curtin in Lindsay. The day after, Eagle pilots engaged Messerschmitt Bf-109s over the Channel near Calais. At least 1 German fighter was damaged in the fight, and the squadron paid for the learning curve, losing 1 plane to a crash landing. 1 month later, the 3rd Squadron of the Eagles was formed. Squadron 133 followed, based at RAF Coulty Shoal. Like 71, both squadrons were composed of American volunteer pilots serving under RAF command. Their early assignments were defensive: coastal patrols, convoy protection, scrambling to intercept incoming German raiders over the Channel and North Sea. On July 2, 1941, Squadron 71 took part in a major escort operation, protecting 12 Bristol Blenheim bombers on a raid to Lille, France, targeting an electric power plant. This was not a simple escort. It was designed to trigger a reaction. The plan had worked. German fighters arrived in force. 25 to 30 aircraft attacked the British formation. Pilots from 71 Squadron performed well as 3 enemy planes were shot down, including another one probable and 1 damaged. Squadron Commander Woodhouse and pilot officers William Dunn and Gus Damon were each credited with shooting down a Messerschmitt Bf-109. The squadron lost 1 plane, and the pilot, William Hall, was taken into German captivity, becoming a POW. For the remainder of the summer, 71 squadron pilots continued participating in defensive operations over Britain and as fighter escorts for bomber missions into France. They were indeed busy, and during the month of July alone, 71 Squadron flew 568 operational missions. In August of 1941, the squadron transitioned to flying the Supermarine Spitfire Mark IIA. The Spitfire, although armed like the Hurricane with 8.303 Browning machine guns, had a higher top speed of 370 miles per hour versus 340 for the Hurricane. Could climb faster and higher, and best of all, it could stand up to the Bf-109 on equal terms. 71 squadron members needed little time to transition into the new aircraft. Within a month, 71 Squadron converted again, this time to Spitfire Mark 5B, basically a Mark 102 airframe with sturdier longerons that supported a more powerful Merlin engine, along with stronger armaments, including 20mm Hispano cannons. By October, Squadron 71's results in Spitfire operations had become impossible to ignore. The squadron stood at the top of the fighter command in enemy aircraft destroyed during that period. The pilots considered themselves to be the best of all the American fighter units, proving this statement with their record, validating their effectiveness. And they were doing it before the United States had officially entered the war. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The war was no longer distant. The United States were now at war. For the Eagle Squadrons, already in the RAF, they expected this outcome, knowing it was only a matter of time. Operations continued. The air war over Europe did not pause. Some pilots chose to return to the States. Others remained where they were, already in the fight. By the end of 1941, American pilots not only integrated into the RAF, they had fought, adapted, and delivered results in one of the most demanding air campaigns of the war. As 1942 began, the balance in the air over Western Europe shifted again. The Royal Air Force faced a new threat. German fighter units were now operating the Focke-Wulf FW-190. The new aircraft, introduced in September 1941, proved superior to the Spitfire Mark V, which the RAF and Eagle Squadrons used successfully against the Bf-109F. The Focke-Wulfs were powered by a radial engine, were slightly faster than the Spitfire Mark V, carried strong armaments, and had outstanding maneuverability. It was not until July 1942 when the RAF found have a competitor to the FW-190. 64 Squadron received the first Spitfire Mark IX. However, the Eagle Squadrons stood their ground. All three squadrons flew a plethora of missions during the first half of 1942. Low-altitude patrols, convoy escorts, and increasingly offensive fighter sweeps into Europe. On March 24, 1942, Squadron 121 lifted off with a larger RAF force bound for northern France. Their mission was to escort 12 Boston bombers. The formation crossed the French coast at altitude, bombers steady in the center, fighters spread wide above and behind them. Focke-Wulfs closed rapidly on the formation, headed straight for the bombers. The Eagle Squadron pilots stayed close to the bombers, forcing the fight into G-pulling turns where aircraft handling and pilot judgment mattered more. The bombers reached their target. On the way home, the attacks resumed, only harder this time. German fighter continued attacking the formation over France until they were once again defeated. During this engagement, 121 squadron pilots claimed one enemy plane as probably destroyed, but lost one of their planes, which crash-landed after running out of fuel. This March 1942 mission was part of a renewed RAF offensive, which lasted until June 1942. By the late summer of 1942, American forces were arriving in Britain in force. The air war over Western Europe was expanding. By this time, the Eagle Squadrons had already accumulated nearly 2 years of combat experience inside the Royal Air Force. On September 29, 1942, all three Eagle Squadrons were transferred to the United States Army Air Force. They were redesignated as the 4th Fighter Group. From late 1942 through 1945, the 4th Fighter Group flew continuous combat operations over Europe, escorting heavy bombers deep into occupied territory. It adapted to new aircraft, new tactics, and increasing operational demands. By the end of the war, the group had destroyed more than 1,000 German aircraft, with hundreds more destroyed on the ground, becoming one of the most effective long-range fighter units in the European theater. The Eagle Squadrons left a lasting mark on the air war in Europe during World War II. Their service in the Royal Air Force and later in the 4th Fighter Group helped shape one of the most successful long-range fighter units of the war.